go to true lateralism, multilateralism. That means we have untrue multilateralism today. And at the same time, we are talking about the rising nationalism, and we have to acknowledge that the nationalism will be present forever, but it could be, xenophobic and arrogant, and it could be also inclusive and cooperative. From the other point, the multilateralism, it is with some specific characteristic features, might be, like multilateralism with Chinese characteristics, or multilateralism with American characteristics, or multilateralism with European characteristics, and going on and going on. And it could become also super scale nationalism. And that was what we had to avoid. And I think, Rosen is the right person to talk about such general topics which are so important to our mankind. Rosen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. You're so right. So multilateralism is about rules and institutions that keep the rules. And let me start with a joke. So United Nations General Assembly, you have a party, great powers coming together, celebrating a new technology that is solving a pressing issue of humanity. The Americans say, we invented that. The Chinese say, we will manufacture that. The Indians will say, we bring the software and service to that. And the Europeans say, well, we bring rules and regulations to make it more sustainable and accessible for everybody. And the party is over. So here's my point. If this is a kind of a joke, actually it should be a nightmare to all of us, and especially to me, because we all agree that today we see global powers that are questioning rules and not bringing regulations, global powers that are weakening and not strengthening institutions. And speaking about multilateralism, speaking about peace, peace is only possible when you have rules and you have institutions that are there to keep the rules for everybody. And when you see today what's going on, and especially as we all agree, we have a record number of conflicts and crises and refugees and terrorism running all over European and global capitals, then we understand that actually, as we all agree, we are moving from one to another global order, and we are in a transition period. And in that transition period, we have global and regional powers putting their ambitions. And some of those global and regional powers, they have revisionist agenda. For example, Putin, long before attacking Ukraine, he said very clearly, this is my power, this is my sphere of influence, and I want this to be respected. And here is my very simple point. If we have weak rules, weak institutions, and global power games, that is bringing us, first of all, before the First World War, because as there is a famous book proving the nations were sleepwalking into the first global war because there were very weak institutions and there were very egoistic interests of the global powers, and there was a revisionist power trying to question the order. But that also brings us to the time before the Second World War, and I'll tell you when are we going to come exactly into this. Let me just very briefly I'm a very positive person, but I'm an engineer, manager from the profession, so I'm realist. And let me give you a scenario. Hopefully it's not going to be realistic, but think about 2024. We have a lot of elections. Do you know that probably the most important election in 2024 is just happening this Saturday? It's not the American one. And it's an election in Taiwan. So let me tell you, you have three candidates. Two are very anti-China. And China is going to be very upset. And one is talking about the middle way. So then imagine you have a very anti-China candidate coming to Taiwan. And then you have also American elections looming. And you have probably President Biden and the Democrats finally understanding their big mistake of supporting President Biden for a second mandate. And somewhere in the middle of June, they have to take a very important decision. Is that Biden, 81-year-old man who is forgetting what he says sometimes, who is falling on the stage, speaking about wisdom and strength? I'll be very honest. I'm not going to be diplomatic. But I was wondering, a very wise president, one of them was the president of Israel, Shimon Peres. Another one was the president of Germany, Gauck. He restored the heavyweight of German presidency, and he had a very successful mandate. And then he called me, he said, I don't want to have a second mandate. I said, why? Well, because I am a symbol of the presidential institution of Germany, which is one of the most important ones. I don't want people to see me falling on the stage, forgetting what I'm talking about, being so weak that nobody is going to hear to me. No, because I'm institutional, I'm not playing strong power political games. I'm a wise man. I refuse a second mandate in order to make the presidential institution of Germany, or probably the United States, stronger in a very special year, which could probably going to define what's going to happen in the future. And now imagine President Biden is taking this wrong decision as a difference to the president of Germany, Gauck. And then you have President Trump coming. The first thing what we all agree he will do is flying to Moscow, talking to Putin and legitimizing basically frozen conflict in Ukraine. And he will basically say, well, that's Ukrainian war. It's European war. It's not my war. Biden puts America last, Ukraine first. I put America first. It's not my war. And then at the end of this year, you have a new Chamberlain, somebody who went to Hitler in the beginning of the Second World War, said, I'm there for freedom. I'm there to defend American interests, and basically legitimizing, as Chamberlain did it in 1939, somebody who plays great power games in a big scale. So if you go to the history of any single country in the world, and especially the small and the biggest and the middle-sized one, they all paid a huge price for great powers playing their great power games, all of them. It's not just my country, it's all of them, it's the same. So that is why when you see great powers playing their great powers games, there is no way to have peace. And peace should not be just peace, it should be a sustainable peace. And that is why there is no way to have sustainable peace if you have strong men playing great power games. That is why actually I just make my final very important point. Who is that project in the world today that is giving a hope that actually great powers refuse playing great powers games? They become not great anymore in order to have not just peace, but sustainable peace. And that project is called European Union. You have powers like Germany, like France, who said, we don't want to be great anymore. And we give a veto right even to all the small countries. For example, today a small Estonia with less than 2 million population can veto big Germany with 85 million population. And that's okay for the Germans because they know that peace is only possible when every nation has a word to say. And that is why, speaking about the reform of the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations, I totally agree with those who say G20 plus, David, you're right, plus, but you say no veto. I would say there has to be a veto, but there has to be a mechanism how to overcome that veto in a kind of a compromise proposed by President Chancellor Feynman. And that's exactly what I would envision. And by the way, again, it's the European Union moving exactly into this direction. The European Union is saying, we delivered 8 years of peace to a war-torn country. We brought Germany and France together that hated themselves for centuries. And we are bringing sustainable, not just peace, sustainable peace, but that's possible if everybody is important and everybody sticks to the rules. And if they don't, you have to sanction them. And you have an early warning mechanism in the European Union, like in the United States. If somebody is violating rule of law and human rights, you have to sanction when it's that not developing as a very big crisis. So we can learn from the European Union, and that is why I'm coming back to my point of when I started, when you see global powers, great power games, when you see strong men, spheres of influence, we have to start being very worried. Actually, my appeal is to ordinary people, to ordinary voters all over the world. Half of the people this year will vote. Please don't vote for strong men, vote for wise men. Because you could be very strong and have a nuclear armed force and the biggest territory on the planet, but if you attack and occupy your neighbor, this is not a wisdom. Could be strength, but it's not a wisdom. You could be very strong and block everybody at the United Nations Security Council because you have a veto right, but it's not wisdom. because basically you're blowing the world order and there is no hope for the others. And that is why I would wish to the voters from Taiwan, to the United States, to Russia, and many other, because it depends on ordinary people, to vote in a way that we have more wise and less strong people in power. And just again, coming to Gaza, because very hot point, I was wondering, President Shimon Peres, who dreamed about peace, and do you know what happened with him? There was a strong man and a wise man in Israel. The strong man was called Bibi, and the wise man was called Shimon Peres. And Bibi was trying to arrest, Bibi was trying to prosecute Shimon Peres. You remember history. And Shimon Peres was, anytime when he was falling, he was saying to his own people, when I fall, hit by Bibi, I always fall looking at the stars because I continue dreaming about peace. But it's a dream, but it's not reality. So again, support not strong but wise people. And that's what we would like to see more, not strong leaders like Putin and Trump and others who actually move this joke about rules and regulations to nightmare to all of us, because actually they're destroying rules and regulations. And of course, there is no way to talk about multilateralism if we have leaders that are playing their great power games. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Rosen. I've got your message that leadership is the most important problem in our world, and vote for the smart minds. And if you find somebody who is wise and strong at the same time, vote for him. So now I have the privilege to give the floor to Cyril Gaburici. He's a man who has experienced about 30 years living in the frozen conflict area. So, and I think he has something to say to all of us, and I would like to hear from him, what was the right things done to keep this conflict frozen? What were the failures? And is Moldova really happy about the present status, or something could be done better? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. If the conflict is still on, I think nothing was done in a proper way. But yes, thank you. My name is Kirill Gaburic. I'm coming from Moldova, which is a very small country, and I don't like the word undeveloped, but developing country, I would call it in case of my country. And we have this situation with Transnistria. So it's a frozen conflict that started more than 30 years ago. And I strongly believe that, especially now, in our days, the solution is in between Tiraspol and Chisinau, and among those people to sit and to be able to have a proper communication. Because what we faced so far, we couldn't find the proper way to have a proper communication. So that is something that continuously is moving from one year to another year, and it's never being solved. Of course, it's important to have partners getting into this. We need their support, and we need the support from both sides, but they can't do the work. So the work should be done by us, by individuals living there and facing that situation on a daily basis. I think we are living in the dialogue that we miss today in our daily activity is something that we miss all around the world. I'm not talking now only about Moldova, but when I'm talking about small and undeveloped countries, I think these are the countries that suffers a lot. At every single, it can be an economical shock, or it can be a social or political shock. The economy of this country is suffering twice more or even more in some of the cases. Usually the poor and vulnerable countries or undeveloped countries are having an immature administrative system. At the same time, it's very highly politicized, and with inefficient public institutions. And in these kind of countries, the democracy is extremely fragile and easily slips into dangerous extremes or radicalisms. And we were talking today about the fact that humanity in our days entered dangerous turbulences, and there are some estimated costs for year 2023, where it's very clear that last year the humanity invested in military equipments and army $2.5 trillion. So $2.5 trillion in 1 year invested in military equipment and army. The leader we talked today, the leader is USA with around $900 billion. But this figure shows us that the competition, that there is a huge global competition. The competition is for power. And that's very dangerous. In the same time, these figures are showing us that there is a global economical model that generates sufficient resources for a continuously development of the country, or of the countries in general, of the world. And if the problems that we are facing today are created by humans, I think we humans, we should be the solution for solving them. And we need to learn how to put, or how to set up correct the priorities. We need to understand that we need to move from global competition to global cooperation, and that requires a lot of efforts. The national objectives also should become, or should be in line with the global objectives. And this kind of the institutions like United Nations, their authority should be strengthened, and their influence on the global organizations should be increased. They should have a proper mechanism for international cooperation in order to be able to tackle these common issues. And when I'm talking about common issues, we see all of them in the list of SDGs, but this is the issue related to the global warming, the issues related with the inequality, the issues related with the pollution of the soil, water, and air, the issue with migration, and the issue related to the fact that not all the people on the globe have access to education and to the medical health care. We have a lot of serious problem in front of us, and we need also people that are able to think in a different way. We are talking today about the leaders that can face the transformation, and these leaders should be able to create a culture, a new culture, a culture of cooperation, I would call it. I mentioned earlier about that high figures that we are investing or spending for the military equipment and the army. Let's imagine that if we, at the beginning for next year, we ask 10% of those money from all these superpowers to invest in these common problems that we have. And I think we are coming easily to $250 billion for solving the common problems. And if we have, or we convince the other stakeholders like business and big enterprises, we can easily double this amount, and we can have $500 billion for 1 year to put the people together that are working for the common problems to be solved, are working for the demilitarization, are working for equality and for the human rights and for the good clean air, clean water, clean soil, and so on. So putting people together for the common problems, I think it's something that we need to do. And at the end of the day, imagine that our friend Zlatko today was showing us a file with a lot of red and gray part of it where we need to recover. So imagine though how much satisfaction all of us will have when we'll see them with green or delivered. I think we have enough funds, we have people, the right people that can put over the mechanisms to things to work. We have skills, and it's up to us to decide what kind of future are we leaving behind us to our next generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I got your message. You know, the military expenses will go up instead of, you know, using these financial resources for the peoples in need globally. And we need, again, a leadership, you know, who will be thinking and looking at the world in a much different way. Thank you. So the next speaker is Paul Weber. And he has a tremendous experience, you know, in conflict solutions and in conflict, you know, observations. And my questions would be, you know, how to prevent conflicts and how it means, again, we need methodology, you know. Okay, there's one proposal that we have to be informed and we need an early warnings, but then the question is who is warning and who is receiving these warnings and which institutions are receiving the warnings, and afterwards we need to mediate it again. Who are the institutions who may mediate and solve these problems? And again, how we can arrange all these peacekeeping processes afterwards. So I know you are an expert, you will give the right answers and we will all be happy. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm not really an expert on these major issues, but I'm a scholar in trying to understand over the years what is happening. I will answer very quickly on your question. What amazes me today in the 21st century is that all these mechanisms existed in the Cold War era, and they have totally disappeared. It is quite impressive to see today that all these conflict resolutions, especially in arms control, all the treaties that were set up, all the hotlines, red telephones that were set up, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, all this mechanism and institutional wiring suddenly disappeared at the end of the Cold War, where we have now fragmentation, no discussion any longer. So all this makes me worry a lot and puts to me a lot of questions. But I did prepare a few remarks as requested in the terms of references of this panel. And I did choose, Mr. President, if you allow, the issue of regional organizations. How can they sort of play a role in shaping a global policy and a new agenda for peace? And here I would like to stress, as a European, I am a European, not just a Frenchman. I feel really a European. I prefer to define that like that because sometimes there are question marks. Europe has, since its very inception, since the Monnet method, since Schuman, since all these founding fathers, has had a very multilateral approach to international affairs, and especially within the context of, and then those days, the European Community. By the way, a much nicer wording than European Union. Unfortunately, Maastricht gave that wording up. I think, I just realized that looking at history, we are today seeing one thing is the declining influence of the post-World War II multilateral institutions, and particularly sitting today in Geneva, the UN, of this wonderful institution that are the United Nations. Now, what matters most, obviously, in 2024 would be where the global issues can be addressed simultaneously and in unison, because these are obviously needed. And there I do have, unfortunately, many question marks. But all that leads to the issue of reform. Why? Because the tone and the ideas that are dispelled before the summit of the future, which will be held this year, lead to this idea. Can we today find at last, we don't have much time, a moment where we sort of take stock taking and then really propose real solutions? And here, I was impressed by Mark Malloch Brown, all known to you. Most recently, he put up a paper which really impressed me, and he said, we can still be creative in marginal measures that could lead to reform. And so he puts aside, as was discussed this morning, the idea, let's separate the part of the United Nations that is working with difficulty, peace and security, I mean the Security Council, from the technical organizations, the technical agencies that are doing excellent work and which still require reform, obviously, but let's work on them first. And there he mentions two articles of the Charter. He mentions Article 27.3 and especially Article 99. Now, Article 99, as we know, was hardly ever used since the inception of the United Nations, but Secretary General Guterres did use it a few weeks ago regarding, obviously, the drama unfolding in Gaza. Actually, it was on December 6th. It's the first time, by the way, which is quite astonishing, that he uses it in his mandate. And the last time it was invoked was when was that? In the 70s. So the question is, can we build up the role of the Secretary General as a proponent of addressing, alerting when peace and security are at risk, and give him this wherewithal and this strength to put this on the table and on the agenda of the world at large. Now, everybody will say, by using Article 99, what's the result? But there is a result. There is a political message that goes out from the United Nations and from its Secretary General. So I think that is already a positive factor, all the more so as he's been heavily criticized in the past. So there is a sort of a wake-up call that came out from the Secretariat. The second point is, which after 99, Article 99, and here Europe has also played a major role, is the concept of effective multilateralism. It is a European invention. It did come up in the 90s, and many reports, many communiques were sent out from Europe, and it has become actually now the main focus of the European Union and its member states to work towards its realization. And as you all know, it's based on three issues: upholding international norms and agreements, extending multilateralism to new global realities, climate, health, and other important issues, and thirdly, making multilateral organizations fit for purpose. This was helped by also the idea that France and Germany launched in 2019, called the Alliance for Multilateralism. This Alliance for Multilateralism was also an engine that allowed the concept to be sort of widespread in the foreign policies of the member states. And I think it has also reaped quite some benefit in a broader setting, such as the General Assembly, where it has also been accepted as maybe a mechanistic way ahead. Now, the last issue I just wanted to broach, and I finish, is the concept of decoupling and de-risking. You know, it's now today a big concept, especially on the trade or on the economic side. But the question would be, can we decouple from multilateralism? Is that even feasible? Or can we de-risk instead? Now, there's a shift in ideas. We cannot decouple from globalization. We cannot simply disjoint ourselves, but we can start de-risking a little bit what Europe is doing with China. But the idea is that we can de-risk by creating new models new approaches to multilateralism. And here, obviously, you have one good example, is the concept of minilateralism that is much discussed today. And again, recently in Jordan by Prince Hassan. Prince Hassan has launched this concept of minilateralism for the Levant region at a regional level, a coalition of the willing who are willing to work on certain economic, social, and even political issues might be the best way to defend multilateralism, which is in difficulty, as we all know. So you see, there's still hope. There's still hope, even if we recognize that multilateralism is in difficulty. There are ways and means at the margin to try and reinforce its concept, even in the dire state of the international situation of these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. You know, I just got some messages. I knew that the mechanisms existing during the Cold War had disappeared. That's nothing new. But I really liked you put an emphasis on effective multilateralism of EU and also the way from decoupling to de-risking, and as well as an idea of regional minilateralism, which could be much more effective than global multilateralism. So thank you very much to you. You know, good ideas. Now I have to pass to David XXVII, and he's going to talk about the arms control. You know, and we are of the same age about that, and we remember the Cuban crisis. We remember, you know, the responsibility of a bipolar world, and not only in the Helsinki Agreement was achieved, but also a lot of arms control and even reduction treaties were signed. For example, nuclear test ban, nuclear non-proliferation treaty, you know, Convention Forces Europe treaty, strategical arms reduction. I emphasize once more, reduction treaty. So, and even there were ideas of nuclear-free regions, you know, and we have some states, you know, globally. I'm not talking about Andorra, but Costa Rica, who has no army at all. So everything is possible, but what's possible globally today? I think you have good ideas about that.
Thank you very much, Aldous. I don't know if I have good ideas. Also, I don't really remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 5 years old. So at that time, you're not really worried about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I am certainly a scholar of that period. And you're right. I mean, if we think back 55 years, 50 years, even 60 years back, disarmament and arms control were the flavor of the decades. Not only that, they were the determining factor, the policy factor in the relationship of the two superpowers. If the superpowers managed to agree on issues of disarmament, arms control, it meant that the whole relationship was much better, better off. And indeed, there was a huge body of law that was created. And the interesting thing is that indeed the Cuban Missile Crisis was the watershed when the world, the two superpowers, realized that this was no way to run a railroad, as they say. I said two superpowers, but then they weren't at the time superpowers, and one of them was never a full superpower. Indeed, disarmament was this favorite flavor because it was deemed as the rite of passage, as the stamp that you have arrived at the superpower status. And what the Soviet leadership was craving was the term parity. And it was constantly denied. And then they said, okay, rough parity. So, but there was a a rhyme and reason to all this. There was also the theory of mutually assured destruction, which was the big gorilla that scared everybody and kept the syndrome created after the Cuban Missile Crisis in place. Let's not forget, the Cuban Missile Crisis was in October 1962. By 1963, the United States signed, and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty soon after that. And in general, the process was aimed at creating this body of law. Now, why was that? Because the term disarmament or arms control was a concept that very quickly gathered a large segment of the national security policies of the major countries. It was one of the elements to ensure national security. Not only nuclear weapons, those who had them, not only strong armored forces, not only large armies of human armies, but also disarmament, which was a way to affirm the strength and the role of diplomacy. And actually, these countries who engaged in disarmament discussions and talks and achieved things, they believed that disarmament was one of the methods of keeping your nation safe. Now, today, when we say the word disarmament, we sound a little bit like Hillary Clinton, who, when she lost to Trump, she said, "What happened?" Because it's sort of, we fast forward and there is no disarmament. Even such basic bedrock treaties as the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which formed the basis of the SALT I, so-called SALT I, even that was discarded. The INF Treaty, International Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which I witnessed being signed in the White House in 1987 when I was based in Washington, and Gorbachev and Reagan signed them. And then when then Chief of Staff to President Reagan, Senator Howard Baker, took the ratified treaty and flew to Moscow while Reagan was already there in order to bring it to Moscow. It was dramatic, but good dramatic scenes that we all remember. And when we asked this question, what happened? I think it was absolutely right. President Plevnev said that things changed after the demise of the bipolar world. They changed for a number of reasons. One was, as I wrote in a piece back in 2001, the US and the entire West felt like, okay, we can all go have a nice barbecue on a beach somewhere because the Soviet Union is gone. This big monster is no longer there. Who would have thought that this could come back 32 years later to bite us? But the problem was that there was not much thought given to it. There was not much thought given to putting together a universal, if you want, or general sort of security arrangement that everybody would be more or less involved in or happy with. There were some placebos, like involving the Russians in the G7 and other things. But in reality, there was no wish or desire to share anything and have them take part in something. And that is what the Russians felt really bad about. I have this theory, those of us who are fond of American popular culture, they had two complexes they developed. One was the Rodney Dangerfield complex, which is an American comedian whose entire shtick was based on, I don't get no respect. I don't get no respect. And the other one was the Glenn Close in the movie with Michael Douglas, where she's pursuing him. And at one point she says, I will not be ignored. And this started happening. So by 2007, the Russians were in an ugly mood. And again, the February 2007 speech by Putin. So we are today, and I keep saying this, today we are at the new stage of trying to create a new world, because what we thought we were creating in 1992, it didn't work out. If it had worked out in the first quarter to the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, we would not be in this position. We would not be talking about why the Russians are demolishing Ukraine and why so many conflicts are coming up. There is no more system. Middle powers and smaller powers are on their own recognizance. Nobody wakes up in the morning and calls either Washington or Moscow asking, may I get out of bed? They go out and do whatever they want to do without checking, and thus they are not really accountable to anybody. So, okay, describing the difficult sort of landscape is one thing, but how do we address this? And frankly, as we discussed in the previous panel, and this was mentioned also before, it's very difficult to get people to talk when there is a total absence of any respect towards each other, a total absence of any will to discuss things, and a total absence of grounds to be regarded as an interlocutor. And this is where we're at now. I was remembering just now, 1987, my first job was assistant to the Soviet ambassador and chief of protocol of the Soviet embassy in Washington, 5 years, 1985 to 1990, Gorbachev time. It was halcyon days. We were working together with the United States teams, State Department, White House, everybody. And we were doing the same job. We weren't working against each other. So when I see now what the Russians and the Americans have created or have demolished in their relationship, I couldn't understand how it could fall that far. But because it has fallen that far, it will take a long time there is not even a modicum of trust. And then you have the Chinese factor. And so this dysfunctionality at the top level among the three countries is poisoning everybody else onwards down. And just to finish, I'm sorry, there are things that were not visible or didn't exist back then. When you have the likes of North Korea and Iran providing military equipment to the likes of Russia, there is something really wrong with this picture. And it will take some time and a lot of effort, but there has to be a will to apply that effort. And how we get to the will, that is the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was a nice review about the history, what was pretty well done in the period of Cold War, and everything now is disappeared. And I would like to everybody to remember the word parity. The parity was a principle of that time, not competition, who is stronger, but to keep the parity, that we are equal, even in a power game. And then the disarmament was a method to keep your nation safe. Today, we have just an opposite. We buy more arms to keep in the desire to keep our nation safe, and that's again an opposite. And nobody is accountable to anybody today, and that's also a reality, you know. And I totally agree about the will, respect, and trust, and that these relations that we have in between the big powers are poisoning everybody on this planet. But I just add from myself, you know, nowadays we very often remember and quote the Putin's Munich speech in 2007, and it was about that the West and unipolar world is the wrong world, according to Putin. But we don't remember American president's speech in 2009, only 2 years later in Prague, when he declared a proposal, an initiative of nuclear disarmament. Can you imagine? We still don't remember the President of America offered an initiative for nuclear disarmament, and nobody responded. So something went wrong in the long run in our world. Thank you very much, David, again. You know, I really liked it. But we have to now focus on something that is much more important than wars, because wars are a problem. But you know, the most important thing is sustainable development. You know, and it's very important to understand what sustainable development may improve before the conflicts start, and what they have to improve after conflicts are stopped. How to foster peace and how to prevent wars. Now I give the floor to Agi Besh, and she is a competent person to answer these questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I wanted to kind of go back in this logical sequence and talk a little bit about the root causes behind all of the discussions that we had. And of course, you know, every conflict is different and contextual. Some have a bigger impact on the world, and others are more contained. But you know, beyond the conflicts that we mentioned today several times, we need to know that there is basically 1 in 4 of the world's population lives in fragility or conflict affected areas. So that's basically 1/4 of the world. So it's not just those big conflicts, but we tend to forget, following the media attention about Sudan and Afghanistan is, of course, nobody really talks about it anymore. But I think, you know, this is all connected. We're talking about the existential crisis of multilateralism, and we're talking about global governance. And I think Ika made this very good point, which I subscribe to, that how can we expect global governance to be reformed where national governance failures are all over the world? You're expecting a global public good mentality to come through at the global scale, when at the national scale, it's not the trend that we're seeing. And this is true for developed and developing countries as well. Many of you are familiar with the Human Development Report and the Human Development Index. So this is something that UNDP tracks for decades now. And for the last 2 years, for the first time ever, the whole set is falling behind. We're not talking about human development falling in developing countries and conflict-affected countries. It's everywhere. So we really need to look at it. Why is this happening? So it's a little bit like, you know, the 5-year was asking their parents, but why? So I think we really need to go down that route and analyze the problems beyond the big global politics, because all of them have the underlying root causes. So, you know, when we look at it and we look at war, and the ambition of peace and the prevention, and when we look at humanitarian response after conflicts and disasters, what we're seeing is actually this is development failures. This is the cause of development failures. And a lot of the times these development failures are happening, really we can pinpoint to many things, but one thing is for sure, it's governance failures. Governments don't work, governance doesn't work. So when you put that into this global spectrum that you all talk about, what has also changed beyond governments don't work, because that's not new. We always had corrupt governments, we always had incompetent governments, or whatever context we had. But I think what changed from the global spectrum is that the models and the examples to follow that had, you know, some kind of standards is no longer credible. It's no longer trusted, and it's no longer intended to follow. So when you're working in Africa and you're talking about good governance or democratic governance, the United States or democratic governance model used to be the etalon that we follow, the electoral advice and so forth. And now that's lost credibility. So it's very difficult to provide advice on governance when the models that we have been following for decades are really falling apart and questions themselves. But moving away from that in terms of what are the underlying causes, from a development perspective, it's really coming down to a lot of the socioeconomic issues. So when you look at fragility, wars, whether it's interstate wars or civil wars or whatever they may be, a lot of the underlying causes are about socioeconomic situation. Societies don't have trust in their governments, and they lost hope in their own ability to have a normal life within the context that they live in. So they're looking for other ways. Some migrate, so that creates a migration problem that, of course, Europe is facing quite acutely. Some join violent extremist organizations, and then conflicts and wars develop. And then the ripple down effect of that is a refugee crisis that goes into countries that in the first place already struggled with their own social contracts, with their own social services. And suddenly they have, for example, an influx of refugees twice as big as their own cities that need to absorb it. So all of this ripple down effect actually exacerbate the already existing development problems and adding to it and creating others. So what we're kind of advocating for is really to address the root causes of this crisis. When we talk about prevention of peace or prevention of wars and peace building, what we're talking about is development. And what's happening because of all of these crises is that we are disinvesting in development, and we're investing in military spending. Somebody was talking about it today. I can give you also the statistics that was lacking. It's 2 trillion for the first time ever in 2022 in military spending. And compare this to the official development assistance of 200 billion that we talked about before. So we are expecting an outcome globally on development, on peace, that is not commensurate with the investments that we're making. So unless we change the patterns of investment, and this is not just about money, this is about investments of political support, processes, capacity building, and all kinds of assistance that we are collectively providing, it's very difficult to expect different outcomes. So what is also interesting is that, just to stress the point of the socioeconomic situation, we had done twice now an analysis of reasons, for example, in Africa, why people and young people are joining violent extremist organizations. And when we did the first set of studies a few years ago, several years ago, it was a lot of the ideology, amongst other reasons. And a recent study last year showed an enormous shift, which was not for ideological reasons, it was for economic reasons. It was to better their lives. So that all goes back to the point where we need to invest. Now, when we talk about the multilateral system and what part of the multilateral system addresses it, I mean, a lot of the focus was on the political side of the system, on the Security Council and so forth. But when we're talking about what addresses the root causes, it's a development system, whether it's the UN development system or we're interpreting it broader, of course, the humanitarian system and the peace system, the peace building and prevention system that's behind it. And we must admit here that I think one of the other problems is that this system is also siloed. When you're looking at the conflict we're trying to address or prevent, the people in these conflicts are not waking up in the morning asking for humanitarian assistance and in the afternoon for a little bit of development assistance and maybe some peace building. They want solutions. And the way we're offering these solutions are siloed. We're offering it through a development lens, to humanitarian lens, and the peace lens. So one way forward when we're talking about what we can do to strengthen multilateralism in an effective way is to bring these systems together that takes it from the perspective of the people whose life we're trying to help or the systems we're trying to transform. The second point is that I haven't heard much talk about, but I think it's quite important when it comes to the root causes. We talk about it in climate, the role of youth, but we haven't talked enough about the role of youth in prevention and peace building. I mean, if you just look at Africa, the average age of the African population, I think there was a statistic a couple of years ago, it's I think 19 years old. And the average age of the leaders of Africa are 65. So basically we have young people led by an older generation of leaders, and we haven't really found collectively and globally a way to meaningfully involve young people into these processes. So the second point here is really to find a way to meaningfully engage with youth, and finding ways where the future is built with them and not for them. The third point I wanted to make is on the social contracts. I mean, why is it happening that, why are these government failures allowed? I mean, part of it is, of course, power and control. You all know that. But part of it is because there are certain social contracts that are maintaining it and allowing it. And as long as those social contracts are maintained, in a lot of the cases, there's very little incentives or hope of populations that they can change the situation. So even if we have societies that would thrive for a different pathway, there's enough in the social contract that doesn't allow that to happen. So we also need to look at how do we work with the civil society and the different kind of elements of social policies that would allow some change to come through. And just to give you an example that's related to this, and corruption was mentioned as one of the main governance issues. We have seen now examples where there are situations and governments, and I will not name countries, but we work in countries where we cannot address corruption head on with the government. We have to work in these countries, and I see, many times the UN is criticized for working with governments that are not necessarily the most democratic. But we can find ways of addressing underlying corruption that allows these governments to function. So to give you an example, digitalization of government services, especially the smaller services, it actually can wipe out discretionary corruption of the middle or small layer of civil servants. And that's already a big step forward, because that means the average citizen actually has an equal way of accessing the services that they consider to be corrupt and unevenly accessible depending on the situation. And my last point, I'm sure other people can add much more to that. I really want to bring in a little bit into discussion and your consideration the evolution of technology and AI. It was mentioned a few times, but it's really huge, and we underestimate, and I think collectively don't fully understand the impact that it's going to bring by. And what is even more worrying, that there is an enormous gap in this understanding between the public sector and the public goods sector, if I want to broaden it, and the private sector and others that are using it for other purposes. So, there's a word that's trying to move ahead on sustainable development that doesn't necessarily understand or has the resources to take advantage of technology and AI. And there is another part of the world that's using it for their own purposes, and the resources invested on that side and the advances and the understanding is a multiplier of the understanding of the public sector. So if we bring it down to the level of governments, I think what's also needs to happen from a prevention perspective is helping governments to anticipate and to have early warnings, mechanisms for the risks that are coming up. So government policies don't only respond to yesterday's problems and today's problem, but they are able to develop policies that are anticipating tomorrow's problems because of technology, because of AI, because of other fast changes that are happening, because these changes are happening much, much faster than governments can react. So what can we do from the multilateral systems perspective to support governments to anticipate their problems of tomorrow? And I think this is also an area where we have not traditionally invested very much. So just to sum up, I think we need to look at, as a multilateral system, beyond the political side, where we are investing our energies, our resources, and our political capital, and what is the outcome that we're looking for globally, and what are the really underlying root causes of development issues that we need to address. And I refer to it in the finance section, but when we're connecting it to the financing, it's very clear that we are playing a little bit of a band-aid mechanism with financing a humanitarian crisis and humanitarian responses, and we're running out of band-aids. And then we forgot about the development side because we simply don't have money to invest in that to prevent and address the root causes, and we're running out of the resources to actually address the impact of it. I think what's the challenge here in this financing side, it's very difficult to sell a product or sell a service or an intervention where the result, if nothing nothing happens. It's very difficult to go to the donors and say support prevention, and the result will be that nothing will happen. But that's the outcome we're looking for, and I think that's the challenge of our inability to measure the impact of avoiding conflicts and the impact of no conflicts actually happening.
Thank you very much. We got some messages at first, peace means development, government's failures leads to development failures. And there is a massive loss of credibility and there are no standards to follow. That's much more important. We need examples to follow, and now it's missing. Then very, very good proposals. Each government must introduce artificial intelligence, and that will create much more, success in fighting corruption. You need youth involvement, and it was really dramatic. The average was 90 years, and the average of ruling establishment was 65. So too big gap. They will never understand each other. And this was already mentioned before, that every government needs a risk manager. So just to understand the risks are nearby and warn, that's again about the warning the governments, very, very, very important messages. Thank you very much. Now the humanity and human attitude is above all. And now we have the last speaker to make the closing remarks, Madame Kalmi-Ray. And she will speak about international humanitarian law. We are all humans. We need to think about the humanitarian law and to respect the humanitarian law. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. The Western world ended the year 2023 worse than it began. It is due to the gulf between its words and its actions in Ukraine, which has been made a priority with no real serious follow-up in delivery and in support. And his unreserved support for the most extremist government in Israel's history contributed no less to his loss of credibility. And now about your questions about the respect of international humanitarian law. The world is living through a time of intense suffering, and it's at times like these when vulnerable people are murdered, taken hostages, wounded and killed, victims of indiscriminate bombing, of brutal warfare. It's all times like these that we cannot remain indifferent. It's at times like this that we most need the law, not an abstract law, but a protective law. In legal terms, the most important rule is the prohibition on the use of force laid down in the United Nations Charter. But if a conflict does break out, the rules of international humanitarian law apply. International humanitarian law was born here. Its aim is to protect and limit the suffering caused by conflict. The rules of international humanitarian law apply regardless of whether the conflict is deemed legal or not, and to all parties of the conflict, aggressor and aggressed alike, and not only to state armed forces, but also to rebel groups or territory claims. The first historical text dates back 1864. It was born of the indignation of Henri Dunant, who witnessed the way combatants were treated in the Battle of Solferino. and led to the creation of the Red Cross. Today, the humanitarian corpus comprises 4 conventions of 1949 and 3 additional protocols. Now, we have also a observation from a claim from South Africa. It claims that Israel's war in Gaza is in the nature of genocide. It is a claim before the Court of Justice, the judicial most important body in the United Nations architecture. In any case, even if the court is not expected to rule for several years, it will have to rule quickly on South Africa's request for conservative measures. That means an immediate stop to the fighting in Gaza and to cease calls for hatred. If the decision of the International Court of Justice or the rules of the international humanitarian law are not respected, the only option left is a diplomatic solution. So.
So the message was very clear. We cannot remain indifferent in any case of when somebody is suffering, and the humanitarian law is designed to protect and help to those who suffered from a conflict. We cannot imagine that any war will not hurt the civilians and people who are not involved in the battle. But we have to reduce these casualties to the minimum. If the violence is abused, we have to apply the international law, humanitarian law. So we have 5 minutes left. Is there anybody who wants to make some statements or questions? Yes, please.
Most of all, first, thank you very much for the most interesting afternoon. But I think that also the very broad variety of all these challenges, what you have, reminded me that when we made the Rio process and we tried to make the report for this Agenda 2030, we wanted to make as comprehensive picture as possible. We might succeeded in that, but then how to go further so that these goals could be also achieved, and what is the connection between them. So thank you very much for the discussion today, because I think that we should also try now, coming closer to the future summit next September, and why not also the Baku conference, to think that in which way we could coordinate such kind of the combinations of different goals, which could speed up the process, not perhaps the whole picture, but some items with that. And that came into my mind, that how to strengthen the processes between the different goals, and then perhaps also to help to create a stronger will for the peace. Thank you very much.
It was almost 2 years ago when a group of us were together in Moldova, just right after Russian aggression on Ukraine. And Cyril was hosting us. We had an NGIC delegation over there. And that was the time when it was not so sure, will Russians do attack Moldova tomorrow or not? That was we were talking about what European Union should do. And we were talking, we had the meeting with the president and prime minister, and we were insisting that European Union, our message was that European Union should send a strong message to Moldova, not with NATO, but with development. And I strongly support any idea that Madam Veres was talking about, to make connection between peace and sustainable development, especially having in here our items 6 and 7 of our talking points in here, we see what is the European Union, for example, and the United Nations can do together. Sustained development goals, as I think Igor was mentioning this morning. Mladen knows very much how much we were promoting the idea that in Western Balkan, we tackle 5 areas of development, regardless of negotiations about accession. It was greater an economic space, a green agenda, digital transformation, health, and whatever. So my point is very simple. If Cyril, when we were there in Moldova, it was clear that Moldova is strongly depending on Russia because of the energy. And it was very simple. I mean, if they did that 2 years ago, if they supported you with green transformation as part of European Green Deal, part of Western Balkan Green Deal, whatever. I mean, today, because you had capacity, intellectual capacity, technical capacity, everything, to transform your energy into green energy. That's just simple idea. What I want to say that I think we should be much more vocal on putting connections in between development and peace building and development again and again and again. Because with all due respect, when we get European perspective, as we got back in Thessaloniki back in 2005, we were so enthusiastic about having European perspective. But today we're a little bit tired of perspective because it looks like we are talking with imams and priests who are telling us that one day in another world there will be much better life. So we have to do something to development moves in concrete, better life today, because that's the best stabilizer for the peace. I think that connection should be a little bit more strengthened. And after all, with all due respect, Moldova finally got open negotiations with the European Union and Ukraine. It's kind of almost cynical. It's almost cynical. You need to be attacked or threatened by Russians to be attacked, and then you'll get the date of the beginning of negotiations. Instead of getting support, concrete support on green transformation, economy transformation, digital transformation, health transformation, educational transformation, getting into it. And that's the way, when I see Ivanov in here, I mean, what they did in Northern Macedonia, they changed their name and they didn't get the date of the beginning of negotiation. They didn't get a date. I'll stop in here.
So thank you very much to the audience. It's 1 hour and a half. Okay, I can make an exclusion, but just for you.
Thank you much indeed. Very kind of you. Some very quick reactions with numbers on some of the notions our speakers shared with us today. I agree that we have a changed number of wars, changed nature of wars, changed participants, changed triggering reasons, and a trend in the disarmament processes. Changed number. Today we have 55 wars and armed conflicts going on in the world. 20 years ago we had 21. So in every year now, 10 to 15% increase. The second, in between 2001 and 2010, around 5 countries suffered from more than 1 armed conflicts on insurgency. Today, 15. It's a 3-fold increase. Wars became more complex. Traditional conflicts used to have 2 or 3 parties. Now, in the case of Syria, in the case of Afghanistan, in the case of Sudan, many others, we have 15 to 20 warring parties. Those who were involved in delivering humanitarian aid in Syria could tell the nightmare was how to make a deal lasting more than 2 hours, concluded with 17 different parties. Civil wars became more international. In 1991, only 4% of the civil wars involved significant foreign forces. Today, 48%, basically every second war. And the triggering reasons, as Agnes mentioned, more than half of the today's conflicts, which are mostly, by the way, in-country conflicts, not between countries, are related to the depletion of some kind of resources, natural resources or other resources. With the arms control regimes, and it's many thanks for the insight to David. In the early 90s and before, the whole arms control regime was built on the notion that there were two camps, two big powers, and the whole concept was to keep these two camps in more or less equilibrium, and the rest of the world was safe. Today, we still don't have how many policies we have. We haven't decided. The unipolar world is gone. The bipolar world, as it was before, Soviet Union or Russia versus US, is not the relevant one. The bipolar China versus US is still not in the mature state, but obviously there will be some 3, 4, 5 other major players, and we don't have any arrangement to include those countries into any kind of arms control regime. We have to work on it, and I think it would be one of the big tasks of the Summit of the Future to make arrangements for the future power sharing. And last but not least, I fully agree that regional arms control regimes have much bigger importance today than they had any time before, because the big powers' influence, global influence, could keep conflicts under control even where there were no regional arms control regimes. Today, it is not the case. Today, the regional arms control regimes would have a much more significance, but in most cases, we don't have those arrangements. Thank you.
It was worse to make an exclusion, because we got two very important messages. The first is a question: how many poles do we have globally when we are speaking about the multipolar world? And the second is a message that I would think everybody would agree: the regional arms control treaties are much more possible today than the global ones. So I want to thank all the audience. I want to thank the panelists. It was really an excellent panel. And I will end up wrapping in two messages. Peace means development. And disarmament is a method to keep your country safe. I think these are very nice messages. Thank you very much to everybody.